Nina Wabiska Mukwa, the Anishinabek Gazan, Dodem Makwa, Manitawaj, the Dunjba. I've been asked today to give a little talk on what it's been like to be an Eastern Métis in Canada. And this kind of stems from all the silly stuff by all these learned people who are saying pretend Indians, etc. I'm a Métis. I've always been a Métis. I was born a Métis. My grandfather was a Métis boat builder. My mother's a Métis. Under the Constitution, as I've said before, a Métis is someone with an Aboriginal ancestor self-professed to be a Métis and no longer has to be a member of a historic Métis community. The Greco-Roman fence that they try to hang, which they did, Louis Riel on, the communities that if you don't have a historic Métis community, like a physical location, um, then you're not a Métis. That comes from the European attitudes of kingdoms and kings and dukes and all that, controlling their serfs, their slaves. And that's basically what the British brought over here in 1763, that supreme knowledge, the supreme wisdom of the, as the ethnologists call it, cultural of whiteness or colonization. I started my journey 73 winters ago. That's how we count our age in Anishinabek. In my earliest memories of sitting on the lap of my grandfather, who told me the stories of the woods, the spirits, the animals, and our culture, that he wanted me to learn the colonial way, get an education, to eventually reestablish the nation. See, as hereditary Grand Chief, following from my grandfather, I was the youngest of my generation. My mother was 13 years younger than her next sibling, and I'm the youngest of the youngest of the youngest of the youngest of 7 generations. So I had a role to play in his eye, and I tried to facilitate that. As an early age, I hunted and fished and harvested. I had a trapper's license. I had a tanner's license to tan the animals, the furs that I caught. And I started hunting at an early age before the legal rights to hunt, all along the Humber River, and helped to supplement our family food. My father also had a trap line. So we harvested off the land, and we practice our traditions. My grandmother and my mother were great crafters, practiced all their traditional crafts. My grandmother was sent away with the First Nations women up in Georgian Bay there to learn how to become a seamstress. So that was her tradition. And some of my uncles, my uncle became barbers. So the men went to become barbers and the women became seamstress. That's the wisdom of Indian affairs. Wabashin, I mentioned before, was part of the Midland Penetangwishing resettlement of the Drummond Islanders from the War of 1812. And a lot of my relatives, or most of those, are all interrelated with my family. So we're all a major historic Métis community, if you want to use community, around the southern Georgian Bay. So what was it like? Well, my grandfather wanted me to have the education, so I got a forestry technician's diploma, and I got a fish and wildlife technology diploma, and I got a Bachelor of Science degree at Trent University. And I got a job with the town of Lindsay, with now the Kawartha Lakes as their first environmental technician. I left that job to go to Ottawa, and I got a job as a scientist with the federal government Water Pollution Control Directorate. I worked there for about a year, and then I transferred down to Toronto as an officer there to work on Indian affairs and Environment Canada projects as we monitored the environment under that function. A lot of this is on my resume. I think it's on on the community website. So I had an extensive career with the feds as well. I worked originally with the Ministry of Natural Resources in Toronto, Sports Fishery Branch, then the Environment Canada. In my last job, it was Indian Affairs, Ontario region as acting senior scientific advisor. I worked there until 2004, and then I left to work on the administrative development of our nation and recontact all our relatives across North America. Excuse me, I got a bit of a cold. But what was it like to be a Métis? Well, it depended on the period of time of acceptance. When I was in public school, I had to go in the closet because I couldn't hear, because I was a French Canadian Métis. I couldn't hear the Lord's Prayer. So a number of us were stuck in the broom closet, so we couldn't go in the classroom. So there was segregation all the way to begin. Nothing like a lot of other people suffered, but it's still there. All through my life, well, you don't look like you're Native. Okay, that's fine. I don't look like other people. I look like me. There was all kinds of incidents along the way of acceptance of who I was. But what that instilled in me is a feeling of not being like other people. And over time, I got to enjoy that fact that I wasn't like other people. I started to take pride in who I was as an Indigenous person. I'm mixed blood. Bastard Canadian, as the original expressions were. And I took pride in my knowledge of my history. I've done pottery, I've done flint knapping, I've done stained glass, I've done leather work, moccasins, beadwork. As you can see on the door behind me, a big animal part. That wolf there has close to 18,000 hand-selected beads. I think there's 14,000 on the eagle. There's a mountain lion you can't really see, which depicts the sleeping giant at Thunder Bay. There is a mountain lion down below us at the park. So I've always been connected to nature and harvesting. I harvest many pounds of dried weight herbal medicines and teas out of the bush every year, and I eat a predominant large amount of wild game and fish. And so I practice these traditions. I practice the culture. I think everything that you see in the background there is my creation. I've made them. I've been doing this for years. So I really enjoy being an Eastern Métis, but it's been interesting. I'll put it that way. When I was with Indian Affairs, I was hired on Aboriginal procurement. I didn't have a competition. I was acting senior scientific advisor for Indian Affairs. When I left there, it was in the period of 2000. I left in 2004, but 2005-06 was the annual review of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement between Canada and the United States, the provinces of Ontario, Quebec, and the upper New York states and the states around the Great Lakes. And this is an annual review since the Boundary Waters Treaty Act of 1906 to look at the pollution in the Great Lakes. They asked me to come in and give a talk at, I think it was in Chicago, on ecological knowledge. And actually, quite frankly, I forget what the other talk was. And I also did a talk down in Detroit when we're looking at all the that was the Toxic Working Group B I was on, and traditional ecological knowledge. And then they asked me to give a talk or sit in the institution and governance workshop, which was 40 people, both from the US and Canada, who reviewed all the recommendations of the 23 working groups on how to revise the treaty. Now, the FBI and Homeland Security and Canadian CSIS all vetted who I was and verified who I was. In fact, I was told that there was a number of Aboriginal communities in Canada who were trying to get me kicked off because they wanted to be on the committee, but I was asked to be on the committee, and the lawyers told them, no, he is who he is, and he's on the committee. So as a scientist who is working on when I was with Environment Canada working on the Contaminants Act and pollution, and I actually drafted the first remedial action plan on the Great Lakes. So I had the qualifications to sit on the Institution of Governance workshop. There was only two from Canada, Indigenous people, myself as a Métis chief, and also a doctor from the Mohawk Environmental Council. I won't say his name right now because I'm not sure if I'm supposed to repeat names. But anyhow, we're the only two from Canada who sat on that working group of select 20 from the United States, 20 from Canada, and then there was chief of the Little Traverse Band in Michigan. So there's three Aboriginals, and in the treaty we got them to include, because of the changes in constitutional law in Canada and the Constitution, we got them to recognize that there's three Aboriginal people in Canada: the Inuit, who are being affected by the Great Lakes water contamination and long-range transport, Indians as bands under the Indian Act, and Métis. And so that was included into the 2006 documents for the Boundaries Waters Treaty Act amendment. So, I've had an interesting career. But after I came back, and I think it was on February 11, 2009, our community put a comprehensive claim into the Government of Canada, the Privy Council, to the Queen and United Nations, and I got word back from some of my friends in Indian Affairs and Environment Canada that they don't want to recognize this anymore. So they don't want to recognize the government, that is, any Métis from Eastern Canada, other than those that they set up as political lobbyist groups. And the only one that I know of at the current, there could be some, I don't keep up to date with all these different groups that are now expressing their desire to be recognized. Another word of being funded by the government is the political lobbyist group, the Métis Nation of Ontario, is a corporation who swears allegiance to the Métis national homeland, which is out west. So the issue is very complex, and I alluded to this in other videos, but the issue is what it's like to be an Eastern Métis. Frustration that people have all these preconceived idea of what an Aboriginal is, and that the only Aboriginal really is an Indian as a band under the Indian Act, an Aboriginal group as a band under the Indian Act, and the government funds them. So that's the issue that we have to deal with. We've never asked for funding from the federal government because under the laws, especially with the new laws, the government has to come to us to sign treaty on our land, and they refuse to do that. And I've mentioned in other videos, it seems that the lawyers and the judges and the government is still on their path of cultural genocide. And I've mentioned this in other videos, so I won't go into it. So it's been frustrating, but the one thing that it holds true through all this, if I have practiced my traditions in all my affairs, I'm comfortable with my being as an Indigenous person. I'm not an Indian under the Indian Act. I'm a Métis. I'm a mixed blood. And I have Scottish heritage, French heritage, and many Native heritages that are all blended in to make who I am. The biggest comment that people say, you don't look like an Indian. Well, I know I look just as much when I get out in the sun. I look just as much as most Eastern First Nations people, and most of the First Nations people, a lot of them are all my relatives. Skin color is not something that denotes a race. A race is a topic of great discussion, but we are who we are. We've always been here, at least on my native side. I predate the founding of the colony, the trade colony of Quebec City in 1608. In fact, the first family, Marie Rolette and Louis Hubert, are my ninth great-grandparents. The first Métis family of Eastern Canada, the first Métis family in Canada recorded in the colonial paper trail was Jean Nicolet marrying the Nipissing Huron woman who is my they're my ninth great grandparents, and their daughter, Marie Madeleine Nicolette, is the recipient of that honor of being the first Métis family in the Colonial Paper Trail, and that's my ancestry. So if anyone claims to be Métis, which comes from a word, I think it's Greek, the daughter of Zeus and Gaia, who's I guess a sky god, or land god. I'm not a Greek mythology person, but a blending of two different people became the word Métis. Their daughter was Métis. And the Americans coined the phrase, the Métis, after they stopped using the bastard Canadien, the bastard Canadians, as a reference to the French fur traders that were taking away the furs from their coffers. So there's a lot of history there. And I think the biggest frustration growing up is looking at the history of Eastern Canada and the relationship with Aboriginal people, um, and just the expansion of our history and the lies and innuendos. Like everybody else can recognize who they are, but as an Eastern Métis, if I say I'm Métis, well, you don't look like an Indian, what's that? You have no rights. You're trying to be a pretend Indian. I don't want to be a pretend Indian. The Indians are people who were stuck on concentration camps. So they call them reserves, but they're still concentration camps. In fact, the Indian Act was the basis of the apartheid in South Africa and all the genocide to the Aborigines of New Zealand and Australia. So history isn't taught in Canada. They take a couple of figures that are safe, and Louis Riel is safe right now, and talk about the history, but they don't talk about the Eastern Métis. We were the fur trade. We were the economic drivers. Kanata, we did it, and even some of the big players. The 13. There was 13 interpreters for Champlain, and 7 of them are, one's my grandfather, and the other ones are all their family and descendants have intermarried with my family. So when you look at the population of Quebec, I would say 60 to 90% of Quebec people are actually Métis. They just don't know it because that's been expunged out of their knowledge. But when the British came here in 1763 in the capitulation of Quebec and Montreal, all full-blooded Frenchmen, and there were no French women at that time, all full-blooded Frenchmen had to burn their flags, go back to France. And they didn't allow any French immigration until 1855 or 58. So they expunged the French from Canada after 1763. But when they did the enumeration of who was as French people that are allowed to stay, there was 15,000 men, women, and children. So who were these men, women, and children? Well, the men could have been from France. Some of the women may have been from France, the Fille de Roi and Fille de Mer, but who were the others that got 15,000 people enumerated in Lower Canada? Well, they're Métis. And so in genealogy, when you look back in your ancestry, if you were there, your family's there before 1763, I would say there's a 99% chance that you have Aboriginal ancestry and you have full rights to declare yourself as a Métis. Now, if René Lévesque had said that he was Métis, there was a Métis nation of Quebec, I would imagine that Quebec would have won the referendum to separate from Canada because they were a Métis community. And they don't teach this history in Canada. Also in genealogy, if you look back and you look for baptismal records of children born in New France, and you look at wedding certificates, you'll see it was a French Catholic society. You couldn't get married unless the banns are read. So you normally saw a baptismal certificate of a woman, usually about 8 to 7 weeks before the 6 weeks that you need the bans on marriage. And most of them, they changed their Indigenous names to Marie Madeleine, etc. Right? They changed their names, expunged their ethnicity, and said they were French Canadians, and they changed all their records. I have one grandmother, and each of her children's last names are different, from Leframbois, de Fournier, and they're all from the same mother and father. They keep on changing. Every child has a different last name, and that's what the priest did to record births. So there's a lot of misconception: who's what, when, where, who, what, how, everything. All those fancy little words about who you are in Quebec and on Ontario as well. I think the first non-French birth in Ontario was in north of the French River was in 1935. Everybody else was Native or French Canadian. So Ontario is predominantly an Aboriginal nation, and it's unceded. Now, the laws of Canada, based on the Royal Proclamation, you have to have treaty with the Aboriginal people, and that's where our court cases are now. I think we have 7 or 8 in the Supreme Court right now. Is because they haven't signed treaty with our people, and we're a large population, and that's what the government is afraid of, because all the government thinks about is how much is it going to cost us. Well, they give money to every other organization that's coming in from other countries and other immigrant groups. They get all kinds of funding, but they don't want to fund the Eastern Metis. Even though we've never asked for funding, we may ask for funding afterwards, but we want to go into the treaty negotiation process. And I mentioned in the last video, it's what we give to them, not what they give to us. And they have a problem and they don't know how to address it. But the big thing is, in negotiations and mutual reconciliations, you're supposed to talk. And the federal government refuses to talk to our nation. They say, well, you're not a nation. Well, yeah, we are a nation. And I think the last video I talked about what a nation is and how a nation develops and who we are. And we are here. We're not going away. And they have to come to terms. So there's frustration. Back to the question of how it's like to live as an Eastern Métis. It's frustrating, but it's a journey. We're on a journey, and we'll finish this journey, whether I'm here or not. It's a whole community. My family has a long history here. Even my grandfather, Joseph Plouffe, that was a name change as well, because his original ancestor in the 1600s was Antoine Bluff. There wasn't a Plouffe. All the Plouffes are deep names. So a lot of the names in Quebec are all deep names. And so it's really confusing when you're trying to go through all the paperwork to find out your interconnectivity to everybody else. So anyhow, I practice all my customs and traditions, and it's been a good life, and I've enjoyed it. Lots of trials and tribulations, but our community has a tremendous group of highly competent people supporting us and moving forward in all the legal and constitutional challenges and economic challenges. Anyhow, I hope everybody has a wonderful day, and bon mapi. I'll see you again later. Sorry for the disconjuncted or whatever talk. It was right off the top of my head, and I'm just recovering from an illness, so I'm not a speaker of note anyhow. So thank you very much. Have a great day.